Star Wars was originally supposed to be about the decline of the Republic in the first three movies, the struggle of the Resistance in the next three, and the rebuilding of the old Republic in the final three. But it turns out now that it seems it's more like about the continuing shredding of the Republic instead. And crucial to this, it seems to me, is the loss of freedom of speech. All through the Jedi movies, Star Wars movies in general, there's a heavy emphasis on the importance of voice. Obi-Wan, when Alderaan is blown up, doesn't say millions of people died. He said it's as though millions of voices were suddenly silenced, much like things that people have witnessed in popular culture this year at various times. And there's a seemingly exaggerated importance of voice to many of the characters, even in the later movies. I haven't watched the movies in full, I've just skimmed around through critiques, but the first things I find seem to emphasize the importance of voice, in that a character can suddenly shift alliances simply because of voices. Ben is changed by Palpatine putting voices in his head, and then switched back in alliance by Leia simply sending him a voice message through the Force. And Rey talks about wanting to hear the voices of the Jedi who came before her. So it seems to me like the characters in this universe are voice-starved. Freedom of speech ought to be what they have and what they crave the most, and what they refer to many times, but still what they lack. So the Force is somehow not addressing the importance of voice, even though it's what its people seem to crave. I think you can see this starting from my last video on would you take singing lessons from Yoda, in that the galaxy of Star Wars is a voice-deprived place, particularly for the most powerful Force wielders, and it shouldn't be that way. There's a tendency for people to look at it and say, well, Christians, for instance, will say, well, I can tell this is not really a Christian movie, so I won't criticize it when it seems to be more about Taoism or Taoism or Eastern philosophies and religious systems that I don't understand very much. In Christianity, though, as far as I could tell from a reference I looked up, which I will link to, singing is the second most important thing a Christian can do. It builds spiritual strength. So if there were a Christian Force, one of the most important things one could do other than preaching would be to sing regularly, I should say, to build up one's spiritual strength. And wielding the Force would, in that system, consist of training in singing. I thought, well, Star Wars is really Buddhist, so I'll look up what singing is in Buddhism. And the first article I got said that in the Buddhist belief system, at least according to this source, everything sings. The animals and plants and wind and rock and forces of nature all sing. So in various religious systems, singing is extremely important and ought to be a fundamental mechanism in linking to and manipulating the Force, and yet it's not taught. And I think this could be seen in the conflict or difference in teaching opinion between Luke and Yoda. Luke is one of the people named biblically, of course. He's an apostle. And Yoda, although it's a Japanese name and has an occult meaning, I believe, called Yota, in which I haven't been able to track down again after dimly remembering it from previous years, is also a homonym of the tetragrammaton name of Yehovah from the Old Testament. The first letter, the Jewish or Hebrew letter of that name is Yod. Yod-He-Vav-He. So it starts with Yod, and later on, vowels were added to those four letters to make it Yehovah. And the characteristic suffix of a prophet like Jeremiah or Isaiah, of Yehovah is Ah. So you put those together, you've got Yod, Ah. So although the name is Japanese, it also sounds like Hebrew. And these part Eastern, part Western characters still, no matter what the religious system you look at, are characterized by this weakness or avoidance of singing. Yoda, it seems to me, wields the Force like a conductor and tells other people to do the same. And that would explain why he says, do, don't, try. Because if you're in an orchestra, your job is to synchronize perfectly with other members of the orchestra. You may not be doing heavy lifting in terms of playing a very difficult part on your instrument, but you have to pause at the right time. Don't be the only one making a noise. And when you come in, when you make your entry to play a certain note after a pause particularly, you don't hold back. You see what the conductor does, and you time it exactly and don't do it by half measures. So you hit that note hard and confidently and unambiguously. That's your job when the commander or the conductor directs you to do so. That's the do, don't, try. Although you are not doing something difficult, you must do it decisively. That's what matters. And the volume of all the other people around you, the numbers, make up for any power you may lack in your playing of that one note or set of notes. So Yoda then says that lifting a large object is no different from lifting a small one. It's not really lifting, because he is acting like a conductor telling the other musical instrument life forces around him what to do. And Force Jedi instructors instruct their students when they are small, as Yoda is small, and they get used to the idea that their potential contribution to the Force is small in relation to all the other life forces around them that they can draw upon to wield the Force. But this ultimately, I think, weakens and distorts their approach to how they wield it. Luke has some of the characteristics of someone who approaches the Force like a singer. He seems to, although he can't quite articulate why he approaches the Force the way he does, wield the Force more like a singer than a conductor. So he initially sees himself as the instrument, his own muscles as the instrument, and has the Force as an extension of those muscles, of that musculature. So the Force does what he does, only just more. So then he can't comprehend the idea of someone scaling up the Force the way that Yoda does. A conductor could scale up the use of the Force almost infinitely. As many instruments that he has access to, that's with the music he can make, whereas a singer has only himself or herself to draw upon. And the training seems to reflect that. Yoda puts an additional weight on Luke. It's like he is training him to lift weights, and he has Luke stand on his hands and run and flip and so on. So for him, the initial training is like lifting rocks, which contradicts what Luke says as a jaded old man when he talks to Rey and says it's not about lifting rocks. If you train as a singer as if you are lifting rocks, the way you would train muscles by putting extra weight on them, then your approach to the Force is internal, directed outward, rather than trying to draw upon things that are outside of you. And Luke's defense mechanisms that make this possible are those similar to some people who retain their ability to sing childlike high notes into adulthood. Although Yoda can't stand it, Luke has an active fantasy life, and he has lived psychologically walled off from the realities of the world around him that might psych some people out and make them give up in the way that they use their voices. That's what he could potentially contribute to Force knowledge. And that is what seems to be lacking, in that although Force wielders spend all their life wielding the power of life, they don't seem to wield it in any way that lengthens their lives or makes them any healthier or stronger. And when they go on to become part of the Force, they interact as ghosts. They are dependent on the environment around them, according to analysts who've done more on this than I have, in order to wield the Force. So on a planet with a lot of life on it, they will be stronger and more visible. On a planet with, or out in space where there's no other life forms around, they will be weaker. And in the later movies, Star Wars seems to borrow more and more from Highlander, and the idea that there can be only one, and that people suck up life, particularly Palpatine from Ben and Rey, when he drains the life out of them to heal himself. So there's this emphasis, no matter which side of the Force, on seeing life as something you just tap and pull into you, and that you don't have yourself. And there's a sense that the Force is not giving back to the community of life when it's wielded by these powerful people. Indeed, as the movies go on, the amount that they seem to drain out of their environment, sucking life out of it, seems to get greater and greater. And these are, in the biblical cases, the people who should be following the trajectory of gradually accessing song a little bit more. The Yoda Yehovah God promises at one point in Zephaniah that he will sing, but he doesn't. And Jesus, in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, is part of a group of apostles who sing. So you could infer that he probably sang at one point. So it's a very small beginning in terms of starting to sing a little bit more. And Luke, named after another gospel writer, would be about at that stage. So there's a hint in the Bible that humanity is essentially supplying something creative to the overall energy field, if you wanted to call that, of the divine. And it is humanity's job initially to be innocent in the Garden of Eden and isolated from the corruption around them, so they can build up this threshold of joy and means of fighting sin, essentially. In that the capacity to build singing capacity is actually a way of fighting a spiritual and moral battle, which is absent from Star Wars. So the critical turnaround point where the Republic stops dying and shrinking and starts to grow and build and become a self-sustaining, life-positive community could begin with a recognition of the need to sing and use one's voice. And there's a possible hint of this at one point in one of the later movies, where when Rey lifts a large collection of rocks and boulders all around her, there is a little bit of orchestral, non-lyrical singing going on in the background. So that's, I think, most of what I wanted to cover. There's this emphasis in Star Wars on the collective rather than the individual, and a collective which must be tapped into. So people, even the supposedly strongest people, have a weak sense of self, which is something that you could look at as a problem in the rest of society today. And the Force is not used to grow or enhance the health of living things around the Force wielder. It's most often used in combat, and used in a more and more costly way as the movies go on. So when I saw the first clip of Rey learning to lift, I initially thought there were blades of grass growing up between her fingers, but then I looked at the clip more closely and in other contexts, and I realized it was just little rocks rising off the surface. And that was something that struck me as what's wrong with the Force and the galaxy in Star Wars. There's a presence of singing at the end of the first movie, and one of my commenters correctly pointed out, and helpfully pointed out actually, that there is singing at the end of the sixth movie, Return of the Jedi. So the fortunes of the Republic can be traced by the decline and slight increase in singing in movies 1 through 6. So when the Republic does well, there's a little bit more voice starting to come in, and when it does poorly, there's less. So I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.